All right, so we're still talking about, this chapter is mostly about long-term memory, as I've mentioned. Um, and so now we're talking about the testing effect, which is the testing effect is, it's nice. It's a nice thing to know because psychology, especially cognitive psychology, is one of the, it's a field in which some of the knowledge which is obtained can be things which can be beneficial to your real life. And the testing effect is one bit of research in a kind of larger field of research about um, how do we prepare for a test? Like, what's the most efficient way to prepare for a test? If you want to perform well on a test, how should you study? Is basically the test that is the question which is asked. And one of the interesting things, I can't see my picture. I want to get my picture up here. You can't see my screen. That's it. All right. All right. Okay. So the effect we're talking about here is called the testing effect, and basically an approach to studying which basically says that one of the best ways to study for a test is to actually force yourself to take a test. So this kind of sounds silly, but it's actually, the evidence is kind of good for this. One of the best ways to study for a test is, well, you're not obviously taking the same test twice, but like a way of doing this in like real life would be like, okay, you have a test in a week. What's a way I can study? I can just reread the textbook again, which is fine. Reading's not bad. Or I could like create a test for myself and then take that test. And so the question is which of these would be a better study method? Just rereading the same material that you've already read, or taking some type of a test, even if it's a test that you like make for yourself. And the evidence is a little bit mixed, but we're actually going to see there's still some pretty strong evidence in support of this idea that taking a test can be a more effective study strategy than simply rereading or restudying material that you were presented with. And the idea here is that when you're taking a test, it forces you to retrieve information. And this is quite clearly well, I don't say quite clearly because there's always things that are controversial, but I guess in my opinion, the most clear relevance of testing, why it's so important or why it's so helpful for you, is it forces you to retrieve information. And I see this problem with many students who don't have effective study strategies, that when they're studying, they study just by kind of looking over their notes, or they might just kind of reread things. But that's not an effective way to studying. I remember, I imagine some of you guys have similar strategies. The way I always studied in college and in high school was I'd have my notes and I would kind of make a test for myself. It was a very basic test, but my test would basically be, I look at the definitions, which are where I wrote down on the left side of the page, and I would cover up the right side of the page so I couldn't see the answer. I would look at the word and then I'd have to, recall the definition. So I was basically forcing myself to retrieve from memory the correct definition, the correct answer. It's a little basic test for myself. Given the word, I cover up the definition on my notes. I cover it up so I can't see it. And then I have to recall the definition. I have to verbalize the definition. And then you might even go backwards where, after I've learned all the definitions, once I've memorized those, I will go backwards where I can see the definition. I cover up the word, and then I have to be able to retrieve that word that goes with the definition from memory. That was my primary study method in college, and it worked okay. I was a pretty good student. So testing is an effective way of studying, so to speak, because it forces you to retrieve information, whereas just rereading something doesn't actually require you to use your memory. When you're testing, you have to use your memory to retrieve information, compared to when you're just kind of passively reading something again. You're not necessarily kind of having to practice retrieving information. So I'm going to show you some evidence. I think I have like 3 studies that support this idea. And one of the main themes which comes along in these studies, and you'll see this right here, you'll see the sentence here: testing advantage is relatively strongest after a long delay. that'll mean more to you once you see the studies. Basically, if you want information to stay in your long-term memory, testing is the best way to do it. That is, studying by testing is the best way to keep information in your mind for a long period of time. It prevents decay of information in your long-term memory. So let's look this is probably the most highly cited study in this entire field. I was looking this up today. This study has been cited over 2,000 times, which is a lot. This is a very famous study. And it's basically the first one that shows test-enhanced learning, this learning effect that I've been telling you, or this testing effect that I've been describing. So you can read the abstract if you want. I've kind of summarized the key aspects of the study right here. There's basically two phases of every testing effect study. A phase 1, which is basically the study part, and phase 2, which is like the retrieval part, where you're tested on how well you're able to retrieve information. But the specific characteristics of phase 1 are important. So in this study, there's basically two things participants did. The first thing that everyone does, they read a passage. And the goal, read this prose, read this passage. And the goal is to remember what you can. So just read the passage, though. That's the first thing you do. Everyone comes into the laboratory. They're given a passage to read, and they read it. Everyone does that. Then participants are randomly assigned to one of two different conditions. And these are the two conditions right here. In these two conditions right here, one of them is the participants basically study by just rereading the passage. In the other condition, the other half of the participants, they were actually asked to study, but the way they were asked to study was by writing down as much as they could remember from the original passage. In other words, it was a test. It was this second bullet point here, the second condition, forced the participants to practice retrieving information about the passage that they originally read. So it was kind of like studying by taking a test. The first group of people just reread the original passage. The second group of people were basically tested on that passage. These people ended up reading the passage twice. These people read it once, but then they studied the passage by writing down as much as they could remember. They were basically tested on the passage right here. So that's phase 1. Half the people just read it twice. Half the people read it once, but then did a practice test basically where they had to write down as much as they could. Then was phase 2. And depending on 1/3 of the participants, they entered phase 2 5 minutes after phase 1. So that's a short duration, obviously. Another third of the participants, they came back into the laboratory 2 days later. And then another third, the last third of the participants, they came into the laboratory a full week, like 7 days later. And then everyone on phase 2, whether it was 5 minutes later, 2 days later, or 1 week after the phase 1, everyone in phase 2 takes the final retention test. This is the ultimate test of how well do you remember what was in that prose passage. And what they wanted to see was they wanted to see which of these two strategies up here is better for helping you to remember the passage when you're finally tested on it, either 5 minutes, 2 days, or 1 week later. Are the people that just read the passage twice, are they going to do the best? Or are the people that read it once, but then they had to write down as much as they could remember about the passage? Will they do better? So the dependent variable in the study was just how much stuff they could remember in the final retention test during phase 2. That's what the dependent variable is, the proportion of idea units recalled. That's basically how well they could remember things during phase 2. Study. So these are the people, they read the passage once. That's study 1. And then they read it again. So study means I just read the same passage twice. Study, test. These are the people that they read the passage once, and then they had to write down as much as they could remember about the passage. That was all phase. This is all about phase 1. right here. Phase 2, they would come in 5 minutes later, 2 days later, or 1 week later, and then they would take the final retention test that measures how well they know they remembered stuff. So let's look at the not surprising findings first. First off, if you take the final retention test 5 minutes after phase 1, you remember a lot of stuff, which makes sense because it's fresh in your mind. If you take it 2 days later, your performance goes down because it's not as fresh in your mind. You forget stuff over time. 2 days later, you've forgotten it. A full week later, you've forgotten even more stuff than you had if you took it only 2 days later. All this decreasing trend right here, that all makes sense. The more time that passes from the time you originally learned something compared to when you're finally tested about it, it makes sense that performance gets worse over time. The long-term memory in this case is decaying a little bit. It's not a very strong long-term memory. It is decaying as evidenced by this decreasing trend right here. But we're ultimately interested in this question of which of these methods is better? Just studying by reading again, or studying by taking a practice test? And so the answer is complicated. This is an interaction, by the way. There is a two-way interaction here. And to kind of decompose the interaction, we have to look at each column by itself. So if you take the final retention test 5 minutes after phase 1, you tell me, based on what you're seeing here, what would be the better strategy? Just rereading the prose passage or taking a practice test?
Rereading.
Yeah. So just rereading. If you're cramming for a test, so if like you forgot to study for a test and you're cramming for one, like 5 minutes before the test, if you're cramming, trying to learn as much as you can 5 minutes before the test, your best strategy would actually be to just reread your notes, to try and get it to reread, just reread your notes, rereading the textbook. But that's because that rereading, the studying again, just rereading it, that's helpful in the short term. But if we go to the longer term, like 2 days later, 1 week later, we can see there's a different story, right? In the 5 minutes, the dark bar is taller than the light colored bar. 2 days later, though, the light colored bar is bigger than the dark bar. Once again, the light colored bar is bigger than the dark bar right here. And the light colored bar is when people took a practice test. So if you're trying to get information to stick in your long-term memory so that you can later retrieve that information when you're taking a test, the best way you can do this is to take a practice test. Phase 2 final retention was best 2 days and 1 week later for those people that had taken the practice test during phase 1. So the interesting thing, though, is the interaction, is the fact that for short delays, the best strategy is just to reread the original passage. When the delay is only 5 minutes, rereading the passage is your best strategy. But if you're giving yourself time to allow the information to consolidate in your long-term memory, like 2 days or 5 days, or 2 days or 1 week later, then taking a practice test is the best strategy. Once again, that's because, at least in theory, the reason taking a practice test is helpful is because it forces you to practice retrieving information. Whereas just studying the same thing again, just rereading it, does not force you to retrieve information. If you take a practice test, it forces you to create connections. It forces you to practice retrieving information, which presumably helps stave off, prevent decay of that information in long-term memory. Questions or comments about this study? All right. Here's another one. There's the abstract right there. And here's a little section to kind of explain some of the methods. But I'm just going to kind of explain the methods and the data at the same time. So this is a similarly designed study. The only difference is they had different types of practice tests. So this final test, this would occur right here, like during phase 2. This is the proportion correct. This is like basically phase 2, the final retention test. But in this study, they had different types of, well, once again, here it says read. This is just when you reread the thing that you the original passage. MC is when you take a practice multiple choice test. And then SA is when you take a practice short answer test. So this study is different than the original one, and in this study, there are different types of practice tests. In the original one, they just had the one type of practice test. Remember I believe it was recall as many of the words as you, or write down as much as you can about the original prose passage as possible. That was the study I just showed you. In this one, you have like a short answer, open-ended practice test. You also have a practice multiple choice test. Both of these require you to retrieve information from long-term memory. And as you can see, on the final test in the study, the final test was a multiple choice test. That was the final retention test in phase 2. And you can see that the people that took a multiple choice practice test and the people that took a short answer practice test, these people, their proportion correct was higher than the people that simply reread the original passage, or obviously, it's not surprising, people that had no studying at all. These people didn't have any, they only studied one time. These people studied twice by reading both times. These people studied twice, once by reading and then once by taking a practice multiple choice test. These people studied twice, once by just reading and then once by taking a practice short answer test. The people that took the practice test, once again, they did better on the final retention test than these people over here. Their bars over here are taller than the bars over here. Questions or comments about this study? Okay, so I'm going to show you a study here. And the reason I'm showing you this, well, there's kind of two things. One, it kind of in some ways contradicts these findings right here. So this is the really highly cited study on the testing effect. And I'll point out that in this study, there's a really strong testing effect for a 2-day delay interval. Basically, the study I'm about to show you, it does not replicate that exact effect. So that's one thing. This study is not a perfect replication of that really highly cited one that I talked about earlier. However, it's pretty close in replicating in the sense that the longer the delay interval, the more effective practice tests are as a study strategy. So they do replicate that aspect. Once again, the original study, they find that for really long delay intervals, taking a practice test is more helpful. The longer the delay interval, the more helpful taking a practice test is. They found that basic same thing in the study I'm about to show you, except that they don't actually find a significant difference between these two bars for day 2. So I'm showing you this because it's a little bit of there's two things. The contradiction, the results don't perfectly gel, but in a sense, the results do gel with the previous study. So here's experiment 1 of the study I'm talking about here. Multiple study basically means you just read the passage twice. You read it once, and then you read it again. And then multiple tests. These are people that basically they study once, and then they take some practice tests. And then the people come into the laboratory. Phase 2 is either 5 minutes later, or phase 2 is 48 hours later. So looking here, the 5-minute retention, first off, does this replicate the finding from the original study? The people in the black bar, the black triangle, they basically just read the passage twice in this study. The people with the white triangle, they read the passage, but then they took several practice tests. And they find that the black triangle is taller or is higher than the white triangle. Does this replicate the original finding that I showed you previously, the very first slide, the one that's been cited 2,000 times?
No.
Why do you say that? It actually does replicate it, actually.
Oh, okay.
It does replicate it, but we need to know why this is replicating it, or what about this is a replication. So remember, this is the 5-minute interval right here.
The short-term, sorry. The short-term part does, but the long-term part does not, because it doesn't show any difference between the multiple readings and the multiple tests.
Yes, good eye. That is exactly it. And so, yes, I guess I didn't ask a 100% clear question. I was only asking about the 5 minutes. For the 5-minute section, yeah, they replicate here, because for the 5-minute retention interval, the 5-minute delay, people that just reread performed better. That's as I was saying, if you're cramming for a right before a test, 5 minutes before a test, the best thing you can do is just reread your notes, reread the textbook. And they find the same thing here for 5 minutes. But yes, as the student just correctly mentioned, they did not replicate anything for 48 hours. And what you would expect to see based on the other study is that the white triangle would be taller than the dark triangle, but they actually don't find any difference. For 48-hour delay, there was no difference between these two conditions. So there's no, for this experiment, this is experiment 1, there's no evidence of the testing effect at all in this study. That's why I say this study kind of failed to replicate an aspect of the previous study. One aspect that it definitely does replicate is they find that just rereading is better for a 5-minute interval. But for the 48-hour interval, which is basically a 2-day delay, testing, just doing multiple tests as a study strategy, multiple practice tests, that is not helping these people's performance after a 48-hour delay. However, they did a second experiment, which is shown here. So this is experiment 2, it says right there. And then for this experiment, they did the 5-minute delay again for phase 2, but then they also did it so for some people in phase 2, they had a 7-day delay. And they asked the same question. Once again, they find that for the 5-minute delay, the best strategy if you're cramming 5 minutes before the test, multiple study, basically what that means is just reread your notes again. That's the best thing to do if you just have short-term memory, that's all you can use. Basically, reread the information, try and rehearse as much of the information, kind of maintain it in your short-term memory. And then if it's 5 minutes later, that's kind of within the realm of short-term memory, that would be your best strategy. However, after 7-day retention interval, they do find the classic testing effect in the sense that the white triangle is now taller than the black triangle. The people that took multiple practice tests after a 7-day delay, they are performing better than the people that just reread the passage. So that's why I say this is kind of mixed evidence for the testing effect. Clearly, on day 7, they're showing evidence for the testing effect. But unlike the previous study I showed you, there's no evidence of the testing effect on day 2. So if I were to extrapolate, to make a generalization about this, I would say you are most likely to find evidence of the testing effect when there is a really long retention delay. For really short retention delays, there's clearly just the opposite of a testing effect. Rereading is the best. For short delays, like medium-sized delays, like 2 days, the evidence is mixed. We have one study which shows that there is a difference where retesting helped you. This is evidence of the testing effect for 2 days. But right here, this evidence shows no difference. So that's 2 studies, both on the same phenomenon, that disagree about what happens during the 2-day interval. Both studies agree, though, what happens on the 7-day interval. Testing effect has its biggest benefit for these long retention delays, like 7 days. The white bar is taller than the black bar, indicating practice testing is better than just rereading. Same thing here. Taking practice tests is better than just rereading, studying. Okay, so this is the testing effect. And I think that's all the data. Yeah. So are there any questions about the testing effect? Yeah, we went over 3 studies, so hopefully you have enough information about the testing effect. Okay, so now moving on to another topic, which is actually probably a little bit related to the testing effect, or could potentially explain the effect of in the testing effect. This is the levels of processing effect, which is quite a famous study. This is another very highly cited study published in the 70s. So this was a study where people were memorizing lists of words. And there was, well, in the original study, there's 2 different experiments. And the way it's being shown here, there was 4 different encoding strategies, which are shown here: the structural, phonemic, category, and sentence encoding strategies. And each everyone, depending on which level of processing, which encoding strategy you used, everyone was getting the same list of words. But people were asked to pay attention to the words in different ways. They were asked to encode the information in the words differently. In the structural group, when they were shown the words in the list, they were said, pay attention to whether the word has capital letters or not. Basically, you're shown a word like this, table, and your job is to say, is the word in capital letters or not? Yes. Or if you see the word like this, the answer would be no. So you see each word in the list and you give a yes or no response. Is it capital letters, yes or no? That's how you pay attention if you're in the structural condition. You're just paying attention to the letters, whether they're capital or whether they're lowercase. In the, in the phonemic condition, you are asked to pay attention to the sound of the words in the list. Does the word rhyme with weight? And so if you see the word crate, the answer would be yes. If you see the word market, the answer would be no. You go through each word in the list and you answer yes or no. Does it rhyme with the word weight? Yes or no. That's the phonemic. Phonemic means pertaining to sound. And then the category condition, you're asked the question, is the word a type of fish? So you're categorizing the word. And so the answer, you see a word and the answer is, and the word is shark, I guess you would say that's a type of fish. I'm not actually for sure sharks are a type of fish, but in this study, they consider a shark a type of fish. And if you see the word heaven, no, that's definitely not a type of fish. But the idea is that in the category condition, you see each word and they want you to pay attention to the category that that word belongs to. And then finally, in the sentence condition, you see a word, you see a sentence, he met a blank in the street. And your job is to indicate whether each word in the list does the word fit in this sentence? So he met a friend in the street. Yes, that fits. He met a cloud in the street. That word cloud, the answer is probably no. That doesn't make as much sense. So once again, everyone's looking at the same list of words, but there's 4 different ways that the people are encoding the word. They're paying attention to the words in different ways. And later on, the people are asked to recall as many of the words in the list as possible. And they want to know, are people better at recalling the words as a function of the way that they were encoding the words during the learning phase? You're learning the words here. And then they want to know, just the way that you are paying attention to the words, is the way that you're encoding the words here, does that influence your later ability to retrieve the words later? And the answer is yes. This is the crucial stuff right here. This is the crucial information that we care about. This is the proportion of words that were correctly recognized. This is basically your measure of accuracy. The words that are correctly recognized, these were words that were in the original list, and you were able to correctly say, yes, this is a word that I've seen before. This was on the list previously. I mean, we see accuracy, recognition accuracy, as a function of these 3 different conditions. So they changed the names. This is taken from the same article as the previous picture, but they changed things a little bit. Case, this just means is it uppercase or lowercase words. Rhyme means phonemic. They're paying attention to whether the word rhymes with weight or not. And then sentence, those fill in the blank. So notably, the category condition is missing here. The structural, phonemic, and sentence conditions all appear here, but they call it case, rhyme, and sentence conditions. And what we're looking here, basically, these are, the taller the bar, the better their recognition, or the better they're able to recall the words from the original list. And the evidence here shows that people in the sentence condition, these are the people that every time I saw the word, they asked, does the word fit with the sentence? These people were later able to recall many of the words. The people in the rhyme condition, they were able to recall a medium amount of words. And the people in the structural, the case condition, were able to only recall a small amount of words. And so this is a famous study. I imagine some of you guys might have heard about this in previous classes. Maybe IntroPsych talked about this a little bit. I know some interests like talk about this in the textbooks. This has often been interpreted levels of processing, saying if you want to remember information, if you want that information to stick in your long-term memory, one of the best ways to do that is to use what's known as deep processing. Presumably, thinking about the meaning of a word, if you go back to the sentence condition, in order to determine, does he met a cloud in a street? In order to determine whether that word fits in the sentence, it requires you to reflect, to pay attention to the meaning of this word. The people that were paying attention to the meaning of the words in the sentence condition, those people were paying attention to the meaning of the words, were able to remember a lot. The people in the rhyme condition, they were only paying attention to the sound of the words. They were paying attention, they were able to remember a medium amount. And the people that were just looking at the letters themselves, whether the upper or lowercase, not remembering a lot. This has been interpreted to say that if you want to remember words well with your long-term memory, if you want to remember stuff well with your long-term memory, you want to encode it deeply. And so deeply here means contemplating the meaning of the word versus just the sound of the word versus the visual appearance of the word, whether it's upper or lowercase letters. Any questions or comments about levels of processing? Cool. Let us continue on. So some related terms is that it's kind of just going over these definitions. These are terms which are in the textbook. Maintenance rehearsal, which is kind of just like using your short-term memory to kind of maintain information in short-term memory. Presumably that's what people were doing in the phonemic condition, and maybe to an extent in the structural condition. You just, when you see the word, you're kind of just saying the word in your mind. You kind of just rehearse it in your short-term memory. You kind of hear the word in your head, but that's basically it. That's especially probably what people were doing in the phonemic or the rhyme condition. They're kind of just saying the word in your head. So this would usually be kind of categorized as like a superficial type of rehearsal, a superficial way of type of learning, a superficial way of attending or encoding information. Contrasting that with elaborative rehearsal, in which case when you're attending something, when you're trying to encode information, you pay attention to the meaning of the things that you're encoding. You're not just saying the words in your head over and over again. I know that's a strategy some people sometimes use when they're studying, is they just try and memorize words, which is an okay strategy. But if you really want stuff to stick in your long-term memory, the best way is to use a elaborative type of rehearsal where you're using meaning to encode information, which is presumably what people were doing in the sentence task, in the sentence task right here, using more elaborative rehearsal here and using more maintenance rehearsal here, presumably. In general, elaborative rehearsal is a more effective strategy for getting information that will stick in your long-term memory and that you can later retrieve effectively. So I think that's actually where I want to call it a day here. So yeah, we're going to call it a day right here, and we will start. We will be applying elaborative rehearsal to some mnemonic devices. I understand how elaborative rehearsal is helpful for mnemonic devices. We will study that next time. We'll finish chapter 5 next time, and then we should get a start on chapter 6 next time. So if people, I know some people wanted to stick around and talk about the papers. Now is a fine time to do that. We definitely have time. Otherwise, you are excused. I'm going to end the meeting, and then I'm going to come right back. So people that want to talk about the papers, I'm going to leave, but I'm going to come right back.